Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to U.S. History Through Film. As we look now at one of the most controversial issues of the 1840s and 1850s, the westward expansion of slavery. Now, early in American history, there had been some agreement. In the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which declared that any state created from the Northwest Territory would not permit slavery, and not really have much trouble passing through Congress. Very little opposition in the North or the South. Likewise, when new states chose to allow slavery, there were no major objections, at least until 1820, when Missouri wanted to join the Union as a slave state. At this point, some opponents of slavery wanted to block Missouri from keeping slavery. If you had a slave already in the territory of Missouri, you could own him once Missouri became a state, but no more slaves could be brought into Missouri, and anyone born there would be born free. Or at least that was the proposal of a New Yorker by the name of Talmadge. Southerners were furious, feeling this was an attack on their economy and way of life. And suddenly Northerners and Southerners began to worry about their relative power in Congress, where the more populous North already had more members of the House of Representatives, but where there was an equal number of slave and free states in the Senate. And thus the Senate was balanced, each state having 2 senators, regardless of population. In the end, Henry Clay was able to negotiate a compromise, the Missouri Compromise, which allowed Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state, but allowed Maine, which had previously been part of Massachusetts, into the Union as a free state, thus keeping the Senate balanced. Furthermore, in the future, any new state created south of Missouri's southern border would automatically allow slavery. Any created north of it automatically would not. That way we would never ever have to talk about it or worry about it again. And over the next 30 years, whenever new states entered the Union, they would enter in pairs, one free state and one slave state together. But after Texas won its independence from Mexico in 1836 and wanted to join the United States, its admission was blocked for 9 years, so that Texas was an independent republic, not part of the Republic of Mexico or the United States of America, and for 9 years. People worried that admitting such a large area where slavery was legal, indeed, keeping slavery legal was one reason Texas fought for their independence from Mexico, which had banned slavery years ago. Not the main reason, but definitely a reason. So some worried letting Texas into the Union would be a huge slave state, possibly big enough to break into 4 or 5 slave states, throwing the Senate out of balance. And so, for much of the 1830s and early 1840s, politicians managed to avoid discussing this too. But as the 1840s progressed, a growing number of Americans felt the United States had a manifest destiny, an obvious duty from God to spread into the West, to expand from sea to shining sea, bringing civilization, light, settlement, the telegraph, the railroad, steamboats, driving aside the forces of darkness, bears, buffalo, Indians, settling and civilizing the West. And although some politicians tried to keep a lid on this, in 1844, James K. Polk of Tennessee won the presidency by promising to fulfill our manifest destiny and to annex the Republic of Texas, which had been an independent since 1836, but which Mexico still claimed, saying the treaty recognizing Texas independence had been forced on their leader at gunpoint. He also said he would annex California and New Mexico, also claimed by Mexico, and annex all of Oregon, which in those days expanded all the way to the southern boundary of Russian Alaska, despite the fact the U.S. shared the territory with Britain. And Polk accomplished all this, although it provoked a war with Mexico from 1846 to 48, which the United States won. The U.S. General Winfield capturing Mexico City in September of 1847. In a victory so brilliant, the Duke of Wellington, the man who defeated Napoleon, said Scott was the greatest military mind of the age. Thus bringing the United States borders almost to where they are today. But it reopened the question of where slavery would be permitted in the West, especially in 1850, where California, which was rapidly growing in population thanks to the gold rush, wanted to become a state, despite the fact that half the state would be south of the Missouri Compromise line and half would be north. They wanted to be entirely free. Some were against slavery in its own right, and some small gold miners were afraid that if slavery was legal there, slaves would be brought in to work the mines and crowd out small free miners like themselves. And so this, throughout this compromise that had kept the peace for 30 years, or threatened to throw it out, threatened to unbalance the Senate, and reopened the whole debate, which raged in Congress. At one point, a pro-slavery senator from Mississippi threatened to shoot a senator from Missouri, a man who in his youth had shot Andrew Jackson. That Missouri senator, Thomas Hart Benton, was himself a slave owner, but he believed slavery should not expand any further, where Senator Foote from Mississippi thought it should. All the great congressional leaders of the day took part in these debates, which seemed like they might split the country. But in the end, one last time, Henry Clay managed a compromise, the Compromise of 1850, which allowed California to enter the Union as a free state, but required northern states to follow a stricter fugitive slave law, which required all northern government officials to return, or at least help return, runaway slaves to the South. Technically, Northerners were supposed to do this anyway, but they largely had not in many places, and they resented being ordered to do so again. Many refused to follow this law, which led to increasing resentment in the South, resenting both the economic loss of the free slaves and the insult to Southern pride that came from this law being deliberately ignored, especially as this law had been the one thing the South had gotten from accepting California becoming a free state, and also the slave trade, although not slavery itself, being banned in Washington, D.C. Southern fire eaters became increasingly defensive of their peculiar institution in the 1850s. And the presidents of the 1850s did nothing to make things better. We had a series of what were called Doughfaces, northern politicians who supported the South in hopes of keeping the peace. Millard Fillmore, the last Whig president, Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, were all sympathetic to the South for various reasons, feeling they had to support the South to keep the peace. In the end, though, they kept no one happy. They did not go far enough for Southerners, but they went too far for Northerners. Furthermore, while the Compromise of 1850 was supposed to settle the issue of westward expansion forever, when some leaders wanted to organize territorial governments for Kansas and Nebraska to make it easier to build a Transcontinental Railroad through that territory, or if there was an established government to kind of protect the railroad builders, Southerners worried that this would lead to more free governments being created, further unbalancing the Senate. So in 1854, Stephen Douglas, a Democrat from Illinois, proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which would allow the people of the territories of Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves if they wanted to allow slavery in their state constitutions when they applied for statehood. An idea known as popular sovereignty, rule by the people. The law passed, but also failed. Almost immediately, pro-slavery and anti-slavery activists rushed into Kansas, where both sides in different ways rigged the votes for the territorial legislature. They fought each other over what kind of constitution to write, and eventually just over revenge for earlier killings, what became known as Bleeding Kansas. Violence even spread to Congress, where the strongly anti-slavery Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts made a speech in 1856 in which he insulted the South in general, South Carolina in particular, and especially South Carolina Senator Andrew P. Butler, who, in kind of a dirty trick, was not even there to defend himself. In response, though, to this insult to his home state and to his uncle, Butler's nephew, Preston Brooks, a congressman from South Carolina, went into the Senate chamber to deal with Sumner. Now, if you're a gentleman and another gentleman insults you, the only thing to do is have a duel. But duels are for equals. Your inferiors you beat with your cane. And Brooks saw Sumner as his inferior, nearly beat him to death, as Southern senators prevented Northern senators from breaking up the fight. Brooks finally stopped when his cane broke. Southerners just mailed him more canes, and Sumner went to Europe for years of specialized treatment for serious nerve damage. And both sides just got angry and angrier as things continued to get worse. Due to the case of Dred Scott, a slave but one who had lived for many years in free states, and eventually sued for his freedom, the case reaching the Supreme Court in 1857. In the Dred Scott case, the Supreme Court declared that Dred Scott had to remain a slave. The Chief Justice at the time, Roger B. Taney, declared that because Scott was private property, it would be unconstitutional for his owner to lose ownership of him simply because his state lines, violating the long-standing right that a person could not lose his property without a fair trial. So therefore, no state law could automatically free a slave just by entering the state. Effectively destroying the Missouri Compromise and all the other compromises of the past 70 years by effectively allowing the ownership of slaves in any state. Sure, a slave north of the Missouri Compromise line might ban the trade of slaves. They might have weak anti-slavery laws, but if a slave owner really wanted to bring slaves into, say, Iowa to grow corn or something, there was nothing to stop him from doing so. This infuriated Northerners. They said the government was controlled by a slave power. The Supreme Court had a Southern Chief Justice and many Southern members. There were many Southerners in the cabinet. The presidents were Northerners but sympathetic to the South. And Southerners were accused of having a conspiracy to control the government and the slave power. Southerners, though, were angry that Northerners were ignoring the fugitive slave law. They were angry that Northerners were sending money and even guns to anti-slavery forces in Kansas. And then Southerners were attacked again, this time quite literally. As in October of 1859, John Brown, a radical abolitionist, appeared in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, now part of West Virginia, with 21 other men, including 3 of his many sons. He and several of his sons had already fought in Bleeding, Kansas, and killed some men, chopping them up with broadswords for the crime of supporting slavery. In Harper's Ferry, John Brown's plan was to raid and seize the federal arsenal in town, seizing the weapons stored there to create an army of free blacks. They would create a nation of their own in the mountains of western Virginia, and from there they would raid the enslaved areas around them, freeing more slaves, attracting runaways, and eventually developing into a full-scale slave uprising across the South, ending slavery forever. Brown and his men very quickly seized the arsenal and took control of the town, killing 7 civilians in the process and injuring 10 more bystanders. Despite Brown's hope, Southern blacks did not rise up to support him, mostly because, since there was no Twitter, they didn't know about it. Besides, even if they did, slave uprisings in the past had always been crushed and their leaders killed. So there was not a lot of incentive to revolt anyway. A company of local militia tried to retake the arsenal, killing or mortally wounding 8 of Brown's followers, causing 2 more to run away and splitting the group up, leaving Brown with only a few men at his side in the arsenal. Brown could have escaped but chose to remain, knowing, I'm sure, he would die for his cause, hoping, I think, maybe even from the very beginning, to become a martyr. And the next day, a detachment of U.S. Marines, arrived in the command of Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Lee, who happened to be taking a short vacation from his job as Commandant of West Point, and so was at his home near Washington, D.C. He had the Marines surround the arsenal. They offered to let John Brown surrender. He refused. The Marines stormed the arsenal. One tried to stab him with his bayonet, but hit him in the belt buckle, which deflected the blade. So they beat him unconscious and arrested him. John Brown was put on trial for treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia, for trying to lead a revolution within the state. Some of Brown's friends tried to have him declared insane. Indeed, at least 13 of his close relatives, including his mother, were known to be mentally ill. But Brown would have none of that. He said he was not crazy, he was just doing what God told him to do. The trial was legal by the letter of the law, but very fast. Brown was found guilty, sentenced to death, and hanged December 2nd, 1859. Now, some opponents of slavery, such as Harriet Tubman, believed he was a hero for what he had done. Others, such as Frederick Douglass, who had known about Brown's plan and tried to talk him out of it, thought that while Brown's motives and certainly his dedication were admirable, his actions were of course illegal and unwise. Douglass and many others feared this would just make tensions between North and South worse. Indeed, a large number of Americans agreed with Brown's execution, at least at the moment. Yet whatever his goals, leading a rebellion and provoking the South were probably not good methods for achieving what he wanted. Although there were those in the North, and as time passed, a much larger number in the North, who saw his execution as little more than murder. And to them, John Brown became what he had hoped, I think, to become a martyr who died to inspire his cause. And while his body might lie moldering in the grave, in years to come, his soul would go marching on.